And I'm just going to say it now that this one is my home personal pick of the week. First of all, I love Veiled Fate. It's an awesome social deduction game, and I am normally not a big fan of social deduction games, but also I have played this new expansion, and I think it adds quite a lot to the game and makes it even more fun than I already thought it was, and it's an expansion that I would never play the game without. Well, at least one of the expansions, because I haven't played all of them yet, but the one that I did play, I definitely recommend. But if you're not familiar with this game, this is a deduction game that uses bluffing and voting as primary mechanisms. And the way that this game works is that each player is essentially going to be associated with a particular demigod, which you can see scattered across the board here. And you're trying to end up with the most victory points at the end of the game. The way that works is that the main board's broken up into a bunch of different regions, and there's going to be these quest cards associated with each region. And there's a whole bunch of these quest cards offered in the game, and you're only going to be seeing a small subset of them each time you play, which is going to give you a lot of variety from game to game, but essentially these quest cards are broken into a few different sections, with each section having a space to put a demigod. Some of these cards might have restrictions as to where and what demigods can actually be placed on them, but once all the spaces on a quest card are completely full, that's going to be triggering that quest card and the related effects to each of those demigods. This could be good or bad for each of those demigods, but the way that all of this works is that players are going to be taking turns performing 2 actions on their turn, and you can use those actions to move the demigods, and if you do move them onto a space on a quest, that also allows you to add either a white card or a black card face down beside that quest, which essentially increases the odds of either the white side or the black side of that quest being triggered, which, depending on if your demigod is on that quest, you might want one side more than another. As more players take actions and move demigods onto those quests and also add their votes into the stack of cards, you'll then be revealing all those cards and then tallying up the votes in one way or the other, and then all the demigods on that quest will face the repercussions of the side that won. All players know who moved which demigod to which quest and which cards have been flipped up there, but you don't know exactly which player added which card, which means that you're going to be trying to accumulate that information as the game goes on, because figuring out who is associated with which demigod can be very useful information when you're trying to win this game. What's really awesome is that once you get to the higher player counts in this game, you actually play in teams of 2. There's going to be 2 of you assigned with each demigod, so it's also really valuable to try and figure out which player is also on your team. Of course, there are a bunch of other actions that you can perform as well that allow you to modify the board in different ways, like moving demigods with more flexibility, or even modifying the cards on some of the quests. The thing with these more powerful actions is that you do have to discard cards in order to pay for them, and once you pass on a turn, you can't perform any more actions for the rest of the round, and the round ends once all the players have passed. Once that happens, there's also going to be a special event card located at the center of the board that has a few options for outcomes, and players that have any cards left in their hand can use those cards to vote on a particular outcome. This gives players even more options for manipulating the state of the game. Of course, there's much more to the game than just that, but the game essentially continues like this over a series of rounds, and then the player with the most victory points at the end of the game wins the game. Like I said, this new campaign is going to be adding a bunch of new expansions to the game, and there's going to be 4 included here. And the first one is the Hadria expansion, and this is the one that I played, and I highly recommend grabbing if you are a fan of this game or if you plan on getting it, because this one actually adds a new character onto the board that isn't controlled or associated with any of the players, but it will follow any of the demigods around as they move if it currently shares a space with that demigod. If quests resolve or certain events occur in the same location as Hadria, then that's going to be gaining or losing her victory points. But the cool thing about the victory points for her is that any player that has more victory points than Hadria cannot win the game. So this creates a kind of push and pull mechanic where you're trying to have more victory points than everyone else, but you're trying not to get too many that push you over the amount of victory points that Hadria has. But it also gives you the opportunity to try and force your opponents to get victory points if you feel like pushing them over that edge is an easier way to get them kicked out of the scoring. But then there's also the Celestials expansion that's going to be adding a bunch of new asymmetrical win conditions and abilities for each of the players. Then there's the servants that are going to be moving around on the board as well, and they can modify the outcome of quests depending on their effect in that location. And one thing that I didn't explain is that demigods can actually be smote or smited or smitten to the abyss, which is a special area of the board. And then as you move them out of the abyss, you get access to a special ability that will be activated when you move to the center of the board. And this is originally determined by a card that is randomly drawn each round, but the renewal expansion is going to be replacing that card with a die. So instead of using the card, you're going to be rolling a die to determine the benefit that you get there. And that's Veiled Fate and the new expansions, and I highly recommend checking this one out if it sounds interesting to you. And of course, you can find a link to the campaign in the description below and click to get notified.